Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 552 for the 19th of May, 2019. Happy birthday, Margaret! You know who you are. Coming up on this week's show, we're going to be interviewing Mick West. Mick West from Metabunk. Mick West, the author of this, where is it? Here we are, this book I have, Escaping the Rabbit Hole. How to debunk conspiracy theories using facts, logic, and respect. What an interesting book it is. I particularly enjoyed the section on chemtrails, those naughty chemicals that naughty evil governments are disseminating throughout the world, trying to change the weather via jet airliners. Mick West also has a new podcast, which you can listen to when you're not listening to the Skeptic Zone. Find out all about that at the top of the show when I interview author Mick West. And then following that, a cautionary tale from many years ago, from over 30 years ago in the early days of the Australian Skeptics, when members in Victoria decided to take on a psychic surgeon, to bust him, to tumble him, to rumble him, to expose him by going undercover, as it were, with the full knowledge of the police force. Did they succeed? What was the outcome? An interesting and unexpected twist in this story coming up from the pages of the Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and have a nice, simple, clean salad. With wasabi sauce. Well, what I do is I make a nice salad. I buy a nice salad, to be honest. And I mix myself up some special dressing, which consists of a tin of tuna, with a healthy dose of wasabi sauce, because I like wasabi sauce. Mix it all together, munch that down. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Joining me now on the line, all the way from Sacramento, California, it's the author, Mick West. Hello, Mick.
Hello, Richard. Glad to be here.
Nice to have you back on the show again. I think we spoke, the best part of a year ago when you were going to bring out the book which I have in my hand, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect. How has that book been received?
Very well by the people who have read it, I think.
Right.
If you go by the Amazon reviews, which there's only about 15 or so, I think there's one person who really hated it because he thinks I'm some kind of Illuminati shill,
right?
Trying to brainwash people. But everybody else seems to like it quite a lot. And I've even had good reactions from people who are conspiracy theorists themselves, and they read the book and they. They don't obviously agree with everything in it because I'm debunking things, but they like the general tone of it, I think.
And how long has that book been out now?
Oh, it came out in September, so I guess that's about 7 or 8 months or so.
Right. Okay. Yes, it's a great read, folks. If you want to get your hands on a copy of Escaping the Rabbit Hole, I'll certainly add a link in this week's show notes. And You've recently sort of come to my attention because I, in my travels, was watching some videos from conferences. And one talk that you gave was particularly interesting, and I'd like you to expand upon this a little bit for our audience. Talking about 9/11 truthers, that conspiracy in this situation. And you bring up the fascinating topic of microspheres. Can you tell us all about that?
Yeah, iron microspheres. This is something that the 9/11 truth community has put forward as being conclusive evidence that there was controlled demolition on 9/11. And what iron microspheres are is kind of what they sound like. They are microscopic iron spheres. And they are things that get left behind when iron gets really, really hot, gets molten basically, because it forms into these little spheres just because of the surface tension. And so if iron has been melted, for example, if you are cutting through some steel with a blowtorch, it will make these iron microspheres. But the 9/11 truth community has kind of glommed onto this as being proof of what they refer to as nanothermite, which is a super special type of thermite which they say can cut through steel, and they think that the spheres are absolute proof that this has happened.
Is nanothermite a thing? Does this exist?
It is a thing, but you don't really hear about people actually using it because it's kind of almost like a theoretical thing. You hear about people doing computer modeling using nanothermite with hypothetical configurations of atoms, but really it's not a practical thing that people actually use. It's more of a theoretical thing.
So they've been using these iron microspheres, to their mind, as conclusive evidence that something untoward happened at the World Trade Center.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a group of people called, I think, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth, who recently sued the FBI. And this is a group of proper lawyers. And also Ed Asner is involved for some reason. I think he is the financer of a lot of this stuff. Ed Asner is an American actor. He's quite famous in America. I'm not sure he's quite so famous in Australia. He was on Mary Tyler.
Yes. I recall Ed Asner. Yes.
Yeah, Mary Tyler Moore. He was the grumpy old guy. But anyway, so these lawyers have sued the FBI, and in their lawsuit, they specifically say the presence of iron microspheres in the 9/11 World Trade Center dust can only be explained by nanothermite. So they're putting this in an actual lawsuit that they've filed in the New York District Courts against the FBI as being absolute proof. And really, it isn't. And the reason I know it isn't is that I myself have made iron microspheres about 10 different ways.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you bring up on many levels. I mean, you can demonstrate how these things can be made in other ways, but to get into the mind of the people who would go to such extraordinary lengths as to put together a lawsuit, and these people you would think would be normal, respectable, everyday people, yet they still have this mindset.
Yeah, they are, in fact, just normal people. I mean, they're not normal everyday people because they are generally lawyers, these people who are actually doing this. So, you think they would, but the lawyers, they know about the law. They don't know very much about physics and chemistry and iron microspheres. So they have been convinced that there is this big conspiracy going on and that the World Trade Center was brought down by controlled demolition. And they get convinced just the same as ordinary people, non-lawyers, just regular Joes, get convinced by watching videos, essentially, and listening to people who are just presenting one side of the argument. Like you've got this big group, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and they put out a lot of videos that make the case that 9/11 was a controlled demolition. And if all you do is watch these videos, you'll be convinced. And that's what happens to these people. And then they think, oh, well, I'll use my lawyering abilities and try to do something about it and try to make the world a better place.
We're talking about movies like Loose Change, I think.
Yeah, like Loose Change is a classic example of a movie that a lot of people actually cite as being the first thing they watched that got them into 9/11. They talk about it as a red pill moment, like the moment that they discovered that there was something else going on. Their eyes were opened. And red pill, of course, is a reference to The Matrix.
Indeed.
When Neo takes the red pill and the true reality is revealed to him. And they feel the same way. And in The Matrix, Neo is a messiah character, essentially. He's the guy who's going to save the world. And some of these people, a lot of the people, I think, feel that's what they are doing, either individually or as part of a group, that they are trying to save the world from these evil conspiracists.
Yeah, they've uncovered the truth. Their eyes have been opened. They know the inside knowledge. They're fighting for what's right. So it's wrong for some skeptics to think that all these people are raving lunatics or nutters or have bad intentions. I guess we can say, being charitable about it, a lot of them are simply misled.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think pretty much all the people who are into things like 9/11 truth, except for the very, very small minority who have some kind of extreme mental illness, most of them are just ordinary people with ordinary cognitive biases that you and I have too. And It's just they have been exposed to material in such a way that it's kind of triggered these biases and got them stuck in this way of thinking. But if you talk to people who used to be conspiracy theorists, they'd come out just being like normal people, and they were normal people going in. It's just now they've realized that they were being misled. And they actually have a kind of inverse red pill reaction when they come out of it. Anyway, not exactly taking the blue pill, but taking almost like another red pill, which bumps them up to the next level of the real reality, where they're now aware of these conspiracy theories, but they recognize them as being essentially nonsense. So people come out sadder and wiser at the end of it.
It must be quite a process. And just as an aside, The Matrix, large parts of it were shot right here in Sydney, and sometimes I take great delight in taking guests downtown to the very fountain where where a lot of the action takes place, the famous fountain in The Matrix. And if you're visiting Sydney, that can be found in Martin Place. Now let's move on to another topic, which is an evergreen. It's an oldie but a goodie, which is chemtrails. And I know, just now turning to your book, you've got a whole section in the book about chemtrails. And again, just for the benefit of everybody, chemtrails are basically the idea that there are evil substances being ejected from jet airliners.
Yeah, that's right. The idea is that the government is secretly spraying, and the long white trails that you see behind the planes are actually some kind of secret spraying program. And the most common theory is that the secret spraying is to alter the climate in some way, to either protect from global warming, or to cause global warming, or just to make the climate better for Monsanto's plants or something like that. But that's the common theory, is that the white trails are some kind of climate-altering substance, when in reality they're just normal contrails.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was under the impression now for many years that the major conspiracy was trying to alter the population by inserting microchips or chemicals that would alter your brain or thinking or something like that. So you're saying that it's more, people are saying that it's adjusting the weather.
Yeah, I think you get that impression that it is some kind of poison or something crazy, mind-altering or something like that, simply because that's the more entertaining theory. So that's the one that the media reports on, and people like to talk about. And the actual rather boring idea that they're trying to alter the weather is not so entertaining. So a lot of the times people get this misconception, and then when debunkers and skeptics kind of wade into this topic, they start off on the wrong foot, and they start off saying, well, it wouldn't be very effective to spray poison from 30,000 feet. When really that's not the actual theory that people are putting forward, so they're debunking the wrong thing. So you need to start off debunking the right thing if you're going to be a debunker of chemtrails.
That's a very, very good point you make, because I have therefore somewhat been in error, thinking that was the major thinking behind the chemtrail conspiracies, which was population control. And when you think about it for a while, I mean, the thought that we could control the weather to any great extent is, well, I guess it's still in the realms of Star Trek science fiction. But I guess in an odd sort of way, it makes more sense that people would latch onto that.
Yeah, well, it's not really changing the weather as such. It's actually changing the climate, which is the kind of the average of the weather, the long-term weather. So, the same way that carbon dioxide is changing the climate, they're suggesting that they're essentially simulating a large volcano and injecting a bunch of stuff into the stratosphere. And this is it's a science of geoengineering, is something that people actually, real scientists do look at. And it's something that might actually be done in the future if things get bad enough. And the scientists right now doing experiments, there's, I think, a bunch of scientists at Harvard. They're about to do an experiment releasing like a few kilograms of stuff into the upper atmosphere to see what it's like. But, really, that's a kind of a good debunking thing, really, because we are in the very, very early stages of the science of geoengineering. And yet this theory says it's been done for the last 20 years. When, if no one actually knew how to do it and we're just figuring it out now, it really doesn't make any sense that they would have started it 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Now, you discuss these topics and many more on a relatively new undertaking. You have your own podcast. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, it's very new. It's only 1 week old. It's called Tales from the Rabbit Hole. And it kind of grew out of the book. The book's Escaping the Rabbit Hole. And kind of the backbone of the book is all these interviews I did with people who are conspiracy theorists or used to be conspiracy theorists. And so I thought that's one of the more interesting parts of the book. And it's actually reasonably straightforward to do. You just, find someone, you interview them and have an interesting chat. So I started a podcast. And what I wanted to do really is to try to increase the amount of understanding between the different cultures in conspiracy theories. There's skeptics on the one hand, skeptics and debunkers, and then there are the believers, and then there's the former believers. And there's also people whose family members, whose loved ones are conspiracy theorists.
Right.
So there's all these different people whose lives have been affected one way or another, and there's some very interesting stories coming out of it. I've done 3 episodes so far, and I've got another one in the can. And some interesting stuff's come out of it. One of the things that I found is that people talk a lot about kind of peer pressure, like the social group that they get into with conspiracy theorists becomes kind of a very important part of their life, and they don't like to give it up. And so they're kind of pressured into believing these things, even though they kind of are skeptical about it. And then if they push back, people get angry at them, and then they either back off or they end up leaving the group. So there's this very interesting group dynamic, which I think people don't think about a lot when they're thinking about conspiracy theories.
I think this is common across many walks of life. This the idea that you belong to a group of similar-minded people. When you push back against that, you're going to get some trouble from other members in the group, and I think that happens across society.
Yeah, I think so. And some of the stuff I was talking about with one of the guys, Stian, my last interviewee, he used to be very interested in crop circles, which isn't really a conspiracy theory. It's kind of this kind of supernatural type thing. But he got the same kind of pushback from other people when they found out that he had been talking to the people who had actually made crop circles.
Right.
There's a group of people who sit around in the pubs in Britain and then go out at night and actually make crop circles, and he chatted to a few of them. But because the group thought that this was discrediting the entire movement, they ostracized him after they found out they talked to these people. So this is very, very, very strict, kind of one-sided, insular nature to a lot of beliefs like this.
Yes, and again, we can see this across many walks of life. I'm afraid this is a somewhat entrenched part of human behavior. Anyway, folks, you can find out all about that and listen to lots of very interesting interviews. There are 3 episodes up so far as we record, all of them very interesting. I've been listening to them today. In fact, I've just been listening to them today because I've only recently discovered you have a podcast. I will link to all those in the show notes, and I can only say good luck to you. Producing a podcast is a lot of fun, a lot of stress, and a lot of fun. I think you'll enjoy it ultimately. And people can see you, in fact, in only a couple of weeks' time in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's about 3 weeks' time, I think, in San Francisco. I'm going to be appearing at the Skeptical conference, and I'm going to be talking about conspiracy theorists and science communication. How do you communicate science to believers in conspiracy theories? It's a very tricky topic.
So, folks, if you're in the Bay Area, you don't need any more excuses now. Get your tickets, and there'll be a link in this week's show notes. But for now, Mick West in Sacramento, California, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Mick West. In my podcast, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, I have extended conversations with people who have been involved in conspiracy culture. I do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's really interesting. These people have great stories about how they fell down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, what they did down there, and what it was that helped them out. Sometimes I also talk to people who investigate conspiracy theories, and they have equally fascinating stories from the other side. Secondly, I want to understand how best to prevent the spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation, which is an increasing problem in a time when alternative media is exploding. The best way to do this is to communicate effectively with the people involved, and the best way to do that is with a nice long chat. So check it out, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, tftrh.com.
This week we continue with our series of articles, items, reports, interviews from the Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics. This week we're going to go back many years to 1985, to volume number 5, issue number 1, and an interesting story revolving skeptics, psychic surgery, and a court case. It could be said this is a cautionary tale when things don't turn out the way you expect. Psychic surgery, a fraud. Mr. Ramon Lopez, legal counsel for Filipino psychic surgeon Lawrence Kacheng and spiritualist Margaret Kingsland, stated that psychic surgery, by definition, involves a fraud. The statement came in a recent Victorian court case in which charges against Kacheng and Kingsland of obtaining money by deception by pretending to perform psychic surgery were dismissed. A charge against husband Colin Kingsland of aiding and abetting was also dismissed. 2 committee members of the Australian Skeptics, Janet De Silva and Joe Rubenstein, volunteered for psychic surgery by Kacheng in July 1984. Both believe that psychic surgery is fake and that it is not possible to physically open up bodies with the bare hands, extract allegedly diseased tissue, then close the body without surgical procedures or anesthesia. Mr. Lopez said De Silva and Rubenstein had not been deceived because they had expected to receive psychic surgery, quote, which by definition involves a fraud, end quote. Lopez said they received what they asked for. Background to the case. Since its inception, the Australian Skeptics have campaigned extensively on the issue of psychic surgery. This is because the claims of psychic surgery do not stand up to scientific investigation. The techniques of psychic surgery involve sleight of hand and fakery and can be demonstrated by magicians. More importantly, the Australian Skeptics see psychic surgery as an issue of public interest because people who have accepted the diagnosis of a psychic surgeon may well be accepting the wrong diagnosis of someone with no medical training at all. If they undergo psychic surgery, they may believe they have been cured and thus neglect proper life-saving medical treatment. The medical risks inherent in psychic surgery were well documented in the American Trade Commission case, Travel King et al., which ordered 4 American travel agencies to cease making false claims about psychic surgery. The Skeptics Campaign. When the chief investigator for the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, magician James Randi, made his first visit to Australia in 1980, he demonstrated psychic surgery at public meetings and on television. The Australian Skeptics were formed at the end of this visit. Since then, Australian Skeptics magicians, Danny Varney and Mike Wilton, have given public demonstrations of psychic surgery. Articles exposing psychic surgery have appeared in The Skeptic, The Bulletin, Australian Penthouse and other magazines. The Australian Medical Association joined with the WA Secretary, stating it was merely, quote, sleight of hand, end quote, and a lot of rubbish. In 1984, the Australian Skeptics invited the chair of the Bay Area, San Francisco Skeptics, Bob Steiner, to Australia. When he made his final appearance on Australian television in May, film clips of psychic surgery were shown with Bob explaining the fakery. This massive television coverage created considerable doubt among people who had formerly believed that psychic surgery did not involve deception. Shortly after Bob left Australia, a spiritualist informed a Skeptics committee member that a visiting Filipino psychic surgeon, Lawrence Kacheng, was operating in Doncaster, Victoria. The National Committee of Australian Skeptics decided to send in 2 volunteers, Janet De Silva and Joe Rubinstein. Janet was accompanied by her, quote, father, end quote, and Joe, who posed as an immigrant who barely spoke English, by a, quote, friend, end quote, actually a professional magician. The police were informed, and both the parties were fitted with sophisticated sound recording equipment. The volunteers were examined by the assistant police surgeon before and after their, quote, operation, end quote. After the operations, the police raided the premises and arrested the Kingslands and Kacheng. The hearing. In court, Janet stated that she told the psychic surgeon that she had a lump in her abdomen. The psychic surgeon chanted a prayer and then proceeded to massage the abdomen. Mrs. Kingsland held her hand on Janet's head, making any movement impossible and preventing her from observing the operation. Janet told the court she heard a ripping sound and then a pop. This was followed by liquid oozing across her abdomen, and Kacheng said, quote, I've cut the roots, end quote. An object was whisked past Janet's head, and there was a swishing sound in a basin. At this point, Mrs. Kingsland repeated, quote, he's cut the roots, end quote. The 2 defendants then reassured the patient that with further treatment, the lump would disappear. Joe Rubinstein's visit to the psychic surgery was similarly described in court, but Joe's altercation with the defense counsel was more heated. In fact, Joe was awarded by Mr. Lopez in his final submission for the defense the title of, quote, the Prince of the Skeptics, end quote, for his spirited presentation in the witness stand. The first dispute arose prior to the description of his operation when Joe was asked by Mr. Lopez whether he believed in God. Mr. Lopez had noted that Joe made an affirmation instead of taking the oath. Joe stoutly objected to what he considered to be an invasion of his privacy, but the magistrate ruled he had to answer because the defendant, Kacheng, had recited a religious prayer. After the discussion of the lump and the treatment, massage followed by popping sound and flowing liquid, Joe gave evidence that a piece of meat was held in front of his eyes by the psychic surgeon. Joe stated that it looked most unpleasant and was brownish in colour. He told counsel that no knife or scalpel was produced during this time. Joe told the court that the tissue, or meat, was certainly not his flesh, as he would have to have been dead for several days in order to produce tissue of that hue. Defense counsel Lopez asked Joe if he had ever seen human tissue, and Joe replied, quote, of course. During the war, I saw many people blown to pieces or shot, end quote. No further questions by the defense on this subject. Joe then related how the flesh was thrown away and a little more massaging followed. During the period he was on the operating trestle table, Joe said Mrs. Kingsland acted as a nurse. After resuming his clothes, shirts had been removed prior to the operation, Joe was instructed by Mrs. Kingsland not to drink coffee or alcohol and was given a glass of milky liquid to drink. It was suggested that another appointment be made immediately. After this, Joe's friend, skeptic magician Mike Wilton, was asked for $30, which he tendered before they left. The tapes of both encounters were handed after the operations to the police, who subsequently raided the Kingsland home and arrested Kacheng and the Kingslands. The decision. The admission in the case by the defendants, through their counsel, now makes it indisputable and crystal clear that the spiritualist promoters and the Filipino psychic surgeon all know that psychic surgery is fakery and involves a fraud. The court held that because De Silva and Rubinstein knew that psychic surgery involved a fraud and had expected to receive fraudulent treatment, there was no criminal deception. It would now appear that all promoters and psychic surgeons in Australia have to ensure that each and every one of their patients are aware that psychic surgery, by definition, involves a fraud. This should be made clear before accepting any monies by fee or donation, providing the paying patient knows he or she is being deceived and the exact nature of the deception. The criminal offence of obtaining a financial advantage by deception is not being committed. Now, some years ago, as it happens, when I was researching other stories in the history of Australian skeptics, I came across some newspaper items published at the time to do with this story. And so I quote now from the Age newspaper, published on the 6th of November 1984. Psychic surgery patients were skeptics, SM told. A story by Olga Fernley. A Filipino man and a Doncaster couple appeared in the Box Hill Magistrates Court yesterday on charges relating to obtaining money by deception after alleged psychic surgery on two members of the Australian Skeptics Society. Joseph Rubinstein of Glen Waverley, an engineer and treasurer of the society, said he went to the home of Margaret and Colin Kingsland of Paula Crescent, Doncaster, on the 17th of July, complaining of stomach pains. He told the court that he had lied about the pain. He had none, and that he had been examined by a medical practitioner at the Doncaster police station. He said Mrs. Kingsland told him to remove his jacket, shirt and singlet and lie on a bench. A Filipino, whom he identified in court as Lawrence Kacheng, recited a prayer and then began to massage his stomach, Mr. Rubinstein said. Quote, I heard a pop, like a little balloon bursting, and immediately liquid began to run over my abdomen. This liquid was wiped off with a towel by Mrs. Kingsland, end quote, Mr. Rubinstein said. The procedure was repeated. There was another pop, and then Mr. Kacheng, quote, raised his hands and showed me a piece of meat. It was not a fresh piece of meat. It looked rather unpleasant. It was brownish instead of red, and in my opinion it looked like a piece of chicken liver, end quote, Mr. Rubinstein said. Mr. Rubinstein said he had been in a forced labour camp in Germany and had seen people blown up. Quote, I know what human tissue looks like. It certainly was not flesh, and it certainly was not my tissue, end quote. Mr. Kacheng, 44, residing at Paula Crescent, Doncaster, while in Australia, and Mrs. Kingsland, 48, faced charges of dishonestly obtaining $30 by pretending they performed psychic surgery on Mr. Rubinstein and $30 by pretending they performed psychic surgery on another member of the Australian Skeptics, Miss Janet De Silva. Mr. Kingsland, 49, is charged with aiding and abetting in the alleged deception. The case, being heard by Mr. Lionel Wilton Smith, SM, was adjourned to the 30th of January. The next news item again comes from The Age, this time published on the 31st of January 1985. No Deception in Psychic Surgery, SM, by Patrick Smithers. Charges of obtaining money by deception by pretending to perform psychic surgery were dismissed in a Box Hill Magistrates Court yesterday. Mr. Lionel Wilton Smith, SM, said he was satisfied that what was known as psychic surgery had been performed on 2 members of the Australian Skeptics Society, but not that there was a deception. Margaret Kingsland, 48, of Paula Crescent, East Doncaster, and Lawrence Kacheng, 44, were charged with obtaining $30 by deception. Colin James Kingsland, 49, of Paula Crescent, East Doncaster, was charged with aiding and abetting in the alleged deception. Counsel for Mr. Kacheng and Mrs. Kingsland, Mr. Ramon Lopez, said the society members had not been deceived because they had expected to receive psychic surgery. The 2 people got what they asked for, he said. Mr. Lopez said it was not a question of whether psychic surgery worked or could be proved scientifically. He said faith healing was practiced in the Uniting, Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, but was not seen as deception. And the final newspaper clipping I discovered again comes from 1985, this time in the Sydney Morning Herald, published on the 1st of February. And this is in the Stay in Touch segment of the newspaper. Legal precedents. 2 members of the Australian Skeptic Society who set out to prove that a Filipino psychic surgeon was a fraud got a shock this week when a Melbourne magistrate dismissed charges of obtaining money by deception against the healer. In Box Hill Court, Lawrence Kacheng, 44, of East Doncaster, had been charged with obtaining $30 by deception. Ramon Lopez, representing Mr. Kacheng, said the Skeptic Society members had not been deceived because they had expected to receive psychic surgery, quote, which by definition involves a fraud, end quote. Quote, the 2 people got what they asked for, end quote, Mr. Lopez said. The magistrate, Lionel Wilton Smith, said he was satisfied that what was known as psychic surgery had been performed on the 2 skeptics, but not that there had been a deception. And you can read the original article in the Skeptic magazine, Volume 5, Number 1, from 1985, together with other items and articles on psychic surgery, and that's all available to you for free if you visit www.skeptics.com.au. And I guess it's a lesson for us all, even when you think that you've got somebody, as they say, banged to rights. A classic case of fraud, which psychic surgery is. There's no 2 ways about it. In fact, it's one of the things that I often comment on when we say, well, is this a fraud or is this a fake or what's going on? Some people can be innocently deceived in thinking they have magical psychic powers. In fact, I think a lot of people are like that. But I always bring up 2 paranormal feats, one being spoon bending. You can't accidentally fool yourself that you can bend spoons. You have to learn the trick. And the other is psychic surgery. You can't innocently deceive yourself into thinking that you are performing psychic surgery. It's a sleight of hand trick you have to learn. Although it is worth noting, there is another group of psychics out there who call themselves psychic surgeons, but say they do it completely by psychic means. In other words, they'll sit in a chair and hum and concentrate or wave their hands over somebody and say they are at that moment performing surgery inside somebody's body. And to this day, classic psychic surgery is certainly still being performed in the Philippines and Brazil, but also right here in Australia. Crop circles are so intricate and complex, it is not possible for humans to make them.
You're not really getting the complete holistic birth experience unless you eat your placenta. I mean, animals do it and Mother Nature always knows best.
Of course the world is haunted by ghosts and demons. It explains so much, so easily, that I barely have to do any thinking.
I've watched a whole lot of Flat Earth videos on YouTube. You know, they convinced me. It's all a conspiracy. There's no way we live on a spinning ball.
We all have friends and family who believe these things, and much more. Well, if you're a rational thinker who is tired of arguing on social media and never getting anywhere, We have a solution for you.
Join the Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia team, and we will teach you how to add reliable scientific and skeptical information to the world's #1 source of information, Wikipedia.
We write new articles and improve existing ones.
We remove pseudoscience, paranormal, and alt-med claims, substituting the actual facts, and we operate in many languages.
We've already reached tens of millions of people searching for information, but as you can imagine, we can never do enough. So please join us. All you need is a PC and the desire to help educate the planet.
In fact, you'll be educating the world while you sleep. Contact us at gsowteam@gmail.com.
Guerrilla Skepticism.
The time is now.
Music by purpleplanet.com.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. Now, don't forget, there's all sorts of skeptical events coming up for the rest of the year. We've got SkepticalCon in San Francisco early next month. There's the SciCon, which I will play periodic promotions for the next few months in Las Vegas. Pity I won't be going to either of those, unfortunately, just the way things work out time-wise. We have DragonCon in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm scheduled to appear there on the Skeptical Track with my old friends Derek Colanduno and Dr. Angie Matke. Just need to sort out my accommodation. And in fact, you may recall, or certainly long-time listeners may recall, the very first episode of the Skeptic Zone was recorded in Atlanta, Georgia at DragonCon in 2008. And of course, we have the Australian Skeptics National Convention, Skepticon, and you can find out more about that at skepticon.org.au, and that's in Melbourne from the 6th to the 8th of December, with special guests, the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, all of them, Susan Gerbic from Guerrilla Skepticism, and many more to be announced. And with your help, your generous help over the years, I should be able to get our reporter Maynard down there to run around with his microphone and grab the odd 60 or 70 interviews like he normally does. And speaking of Maynard, check out his podcasts and other shows at maynard.com.au. I notice he's got a few more events coming up here in Sydney, in Glebe, in the Red Bar. Lots of fun. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to people who listen after the music. Yes, it's the dice game once again. I've got a 10-sided die here. Oh, I don't. Where's it gone? I've got a 20-sided die. Huh. I must look at... Wait a minute. Where's my... This is my box of die here. Dice. I always get those confused. Here we go. There's a 10-sided one. What's this? A 6-sided? 20... I've got a 60-sided one in there. Good grief. Anyway, we'll do traditional. And go with a 10-sided die. I'm going to roll this die 10 times. No, that's wrong. I'm going to roll... Maybe if I had a 3-sided die, I could roll it 10 times. I do have a 3-sided die. Where's that? Is that it? No. Let me roll a 10-sided die 3 times. And this is where you get to use your predicting power, your psychic magical powers to see if you can foresee the future and predict what number's going to come up. I'm going to put it in this little tub. Do it a bit differently today. All right, so predict away. The first number, it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. Predicting, here we go. And it's come to rest on number 3. I always have to write these down because okay, number 3. Second one coming up, here we go. 1. 3 and 1, okay. And the last number, predicting, here we go. Extra long rattle. 5. So, this week's lucky numbers are 3, 1, and 5.